So we have today a panel of the leading experts and practitioners who work on the issue of inclusive peace building in Cyprus for all their life. Right? So I will give more time for them to introduce themselves and have a discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being there. A lot of faces we don't recognize, so that's brilliant. We're speaking to our unusual suspects and hoping for a stimulated discussion. I'll be chairing the panel. Today we focus on peace building methodologies, peace negotiation methodologies, not substance, but focusing more on process. I'm going to pass the word to Meltem first. I'll introduce her in a minute. Then we'll hear from Nia, Charis, and Allison. Meltem has been the former political advisor of Akıncı during the negotiations. She was there in Crans-Montana. But even before then, she's been a peace builder, a historian, and an activist for over 3 decades. Also the president and the founder of Cyprus Peace and Dialogue Center. And she's been one of the leading activists and civil society members behind inclusive, consultative peace processes. So I think in terms of contributing to redesigning and rethinking the peace process in Cyprus, there isn't a more accredited and decorated panel that you can see than these 3 people here, Meltem, Neo, and Charis. So I'm going to give the word to Meltem to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, İlke. Your words made me feel responsible about all the failures so far, because we don't reach out to a peaceful settlement yet. Maybe together with you. It's meaningful that we continue our conversation here in the buffer zone. And I assume that you already became sort of expert on Cyprus issue as well. I'm sure that you understand what we are talking about because you all work on the conflict zones and peace activities and peace building. So I will build on all these. Yesterday, I and Charis, since we spoke about contact, trust, and the limits of change, I would like to take the discussion one step further and ask a more practical question. If decades of bicommunal work that İlke already mentioned via my biography or something, and trust building didn't bring us to a settlement, what needs to be done differently? This is the question that we focus for the last 5 years, even more if we take it from 2017, the failure in Crans-Montana, and after 2020 elections in the Turkish Cypriot community, because the new leader who was elected in 2020 with Turkey, they changed even the track to 2 states from the federal solution. So our conclusion after many years of bicommunal work in Cyprus was that contact and trust building matter deeply, but they are not enough if they remain disconnected from the substance and design of the peace process itself. After 2 decades of intense bicommunal work, many of us had to confront a difficult reality. We didn't arrive at a settlement. We didn't meaningfully institutionalize civic participation in the peace process. And we didn't sufficiently extend the impact of peace work into wider society and mainstream politics. Indeed, in recent years, we have even seen the erosion of what had long been the common ground of the peace process itself, which was the framework of a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality. It was from this concern that we decided, all sitting here, some are sitting over there, some are not here today, like Errol Kaymak and Fiona Mullen, etc. And many people, we are together working and reflecting under the Cyprus Peace and Dialogue Center, which is doing more political reconciliation stuff, try to do things a little bit differently, try to figure out the missing element in the peace process. So we simply explore a different approach, one that engages not only in trust building, but also in the substance, methodology, and process design of peacemaking itself. This meant asking a different kind of question. What would it mean for civil society, not only to support reconciliation in a general sense, but to engage seriously with both the substance and the methodology of a future peace process? In other words, we wanted to engage not only with what is being negotiated, but also with how it is negotiated, not only with building trust between communities, but with how civic energy, political knowledge, and public ownership can be translated into a process that actually supports a settlement, whatever it is. And this pushed us into two directions at the same time. First, we went back to the accumulated body of negotiations at the civic level, the convergences. Okay, we were also semi-policy makers, so insider information helped, to be honest. And also the network of the policymakers from both sides, they were willing to attend our meetings. So we went over the convergences, the frameworks, and the knowledge produced over decades of formal talks, and asked a simple question: how much substantive distance is really left? And our conclusion, as most probably you have already heard from Mr. Mauro Yannis and Mr. Nami, and they were also part of the discussions with us, with other negotiators as well, not only them. And I must say that not only the similar minded people, there were disagreements among ourselves as well. But we reached the same conclusion, which was that substance is already there in one form or another. The Cyprus problem is therefore no longer blocked primarily by a lack of ideas or parameters, but by a combination of insufficient political willingness, maybe political courage, political leadership, risk-taking, weak public ownership, and repeated shortcomings in how the process itself has been designed and conducted. Second, we turned to methodology. Our conclusion there was equally clear. Okay, we had different ideas about when we enter into the details, but generally in principle, there was a joint understanding, which was that this time cannot simply mean returning to the same process with the same weaknesses. If negotiations resume, it cannot just be another cycle of elite talks. High secrecy, supposedly it's confidential, but everything leaks to the press. But you know that leakage, instead of helping, it gives harm, because it's not like being transparent. It's leakages, so everybody starts to prove that it's not correct. So whether it is 100% correct, you never know, because it's just a leakage. So this is also a weakness for us. I mean, this secrecy and full confidentiality, so it's not transparent, and limited public preparation, especially among the Greek Cypriot community for us, Turkey Cypriot community, because they're constantly paying some consequences and some cost after each failure. They are willing to watch and follow what's going on in a better sense, but still, especially after Crans Montana and after 2022, they also need public preparation because they have strong perceptions which mostly are negative at the moment. So sometimes I feel that after all these trust building activities, we need to start from the scratch regarding the trust, especially the political trust, because it's different. The relationship and trust between the individuals, there is no problem. They trust. But when it comes the political trust to the majorities of one community, so we can say that communities, they don't trust each other's intentions, or they don't trust that they are equally willing to proceed with equally joint understanding towards it. So we don't want then it can just be another cycle of elite talks. I say high secrecy, limited public preparation, periodic crisis, and then at the end an expectation that society will endorse an immensely complex settlement text and the referendums simultaneously. So how it would be. A more credible process also needs clearer sequencing, agreed milestones, if you like, we can name it milestones, and tangible reassurances along the way, not because these replace political will, of course, but because they can help sustain momentum, reduce uncertainty, and create a sense that progress is producing something concrete before the very end of the process. That is why, together with our Greek Cypriot counterparts in Apophazi Irinis, here again one parenthesis, in fact we are bicommunal groups. But sometimes we partner with monocommunal groups as well, such as Apophazi Irinis, Determination for Peace. They are homogeneously Greek Cypriot, pro-solution, diverse group from different political parties. So it's an important group for me. So we partner with them as well as bicommunal, but the Greek Cypriot counterparts in Apophazi Irinis. We argued that this time should be different, more carefully prepared, more results-oriented, more transparent where possible, and supported by agreed mechanisms for handling deadlock and by more meaningful civic participation that I'm sure Neophytos and others will detail these. In practice, this also meant trying to work across levels. On the one hand, CPDC initiated a number of structured bicommunal deliberation sessions involving key political stakeholders, current and former officials, negotiators, party figures, and other influential actors, because we felt that any serious civic contribution had to remain connected to the political realities of the process and to those who shape it. On the other hand, we were equally concerned with how this work could be translated back to the wider public, how citizens could be better informed, better prepared, and more meaningfully involved, not as passive observers at the end of a process, but as participants in a broader culture of shared responsibility. So for us, the challenge was not simply to move from the top down or from the bottom up, but to create a more credible link between the two, between elite level political deliberation, because we need them. Without the elected political elites, we know that we will not make it. But a link with the grassroots civic engagement, lay people, let's say, between substantive knowledge and public understanding, and between peace process design and wider societal ownership. This is also where our interest in consultative and deliberative mechanisms comes in. We began exploring whether structured civic processes, including consultative assemblies or citizens' assemblies, could help create that missing link, not by replacing formal negotiations. I'm repeating these things because we receive negative criticism from the politicians or reservations, let's say, in a polite way, but by preparing citizens for the difficult trade-offs of a settlement requires, widening ownership of the process and creating channel through which informed civic reflection can feed back into the broader peace effort. But for us, the idea was never simply to add participation at the margins. It was to think more broadly about the civic tools a peace process might need if it is to be more resilient and more publicly grounded, deliberative forms that prepare citizens for compromise, if you like, fast feedback mechanisms that can give negotiators a better sense of societal concerns and acceptance levels, and consultative structures that can help to address implementation difficulties, ambiguities, or even deadlocks if a process moves into a transitional phase. In that sense, consultative and deliberative mechanisms are not simply participatory add-ons. They are tools of public preparedness, legitimacy, and responsibility sharing. And if designed well, they can also help sustain momentum and public confidence during a difficult negotiation process, while supporting leaders in making difficult and sensitive decisions. We also believe that this line of thinking has already begun to resonate at the policy level. Yesterday we were talking with Neo if we had already an impact or not. The recent announcement by the leaders of a consultative body suggests that some of the ideas being advanced around civic participation and citizen involvement are being to enter the political conversation. What matters now, of course, is whether such a mechanism will be designed in a meaningful and deliberative way rather than as purely symbolic gesture. This is the risk that we can expect. And let me end with this. I still believe deeply in the value of bicommunal peace work. I come from it. I helped build parts of it, and I know how important it has been. But I also think we have reached a point where civic peace work in Cyprus must become more politically literate, more process-oriented, and more structurally ambitious. That, for me, is what CPDC and many other organizations in Cyprus has tried to do in partnerships in an inclusive way, to move from contact alone to contact plus substance, from goodwill alone to goodwill plus process design, and from civic activity at the margins to civic engagement with the architecture of peace itself. If the next phase of the Cyprus peace process is to be different, then civil society cannot simply be asked to support it from the outside. It must be helped to understand it, shape it, and sustain it, not in a way that replaces political leadership, but in a way that makes a future settlement more democratic, more resilient, and more genuinely owned by the people who will have to live with it. Thank you. And thank you for
Thank you. Thank you, Meltem, for a very detailed and comprehensive framing. And three things I take from this is that if peace building work, not just bottom up or top down, can be meaningful, we need structure. And it cannot be fuzzy. It cannot be just built on voluntarism and altruism. It needs that structure. And for that structure to produce something meaningful, it needs to be representative. And that cannot just depend on voluntarism and altruism. It needs to represent all parts of society, whether we agree with them or not. And for those two things to actually work, it needs to be resourced. And it needs to be really well resourced, because I think sometimes we forget that part out, and then we cannot sustain the efforts. So with this, I'll pass the the ball to Neo, a true scholarly practitioner. You can run into him in Japan, in Bosnia, in the States, in Warwick. He is everywhere. Sometimes I feel like he's got a clone. And a true conflict resolution expert with a lot of comparative experience. So over to you, Neo.
Thank you very much, İlke. Last time I was in Sarajevo, I was talking to a colleague from the United Nations, and they said, your project looked very promising, but we had just a meeting with İlke and SCORE, and we were going to be working with them because they have so much more experience than you have and so much more to offer. So I'm returning the compliment back to you. Your work has been prominent everywhere across conflict societies. So I would like very quickly to talk about the origins of the idea of involving citizens in Cyprus, how it could be negotiated and how it has been negotiated so far. With Cyprus Peace and Dialogue Center leading this discussion, and what scenarios can we predict in the future with regards to citizens, from the symbolic one to the more substantive participation of citizens. So to begin with, this is not an old idea. Whenever I talk about anything on the Cyprus conflict, I could see my mental citations everywhere and what they have done in the past. It's very hard for a problem that has been around for so long to introduce new ideas. At the same time, if anybody's working on the Cyprus problem, the easiest essay to write is what has been decided wrongly in terms of process design through these years, in conjunction with the big theories in conflict resolution. In fact, if you take everything that has been done in Cyprus and compare it to the literature in conflict resolution, it almost ticks every box in doing things wrong. Every box. It's as if someone has told the Cypriot leaders do everything wrong to block the negotiations. And this is where we start by involving citizens, because we have seen the failure of elite politics. And this is not unprecedented for Cyprus. Reading about deliberative democracy and your book recently, Allison, one of the things that comes out of the literature is that often us as scholars, we're so much obsessed with ideas that we make wrong decisions. Elites, even academics. I'm not taking ourselves out of the elite bubble here. Well, when the citizens are involved, they come up with fresh minds, and often with the average thinking, you can get more in terms of both the efficacy of ideas, but also the legitimacy of the idea. So leader-led negotiations, problematic, has failed so far. We need a fresh start. We need to think of new ideas. Now, these ideas have been around, as I said, for a while now. They have been around for many, many years, but there has been something new introduced by the Cyprus Dialogue, Peace and Dialogue Center, I think, that is unprecedented in the Cyprus negotiations. As various projects, we contributed to the work of the center, but the credit goes to the particular work that Meltem and others have done through this process. And here one should acknowledge the legacy of Mustafa Akinci. I met him personally in Kosovo and Northern Ireland when we were visiting through peace work. So when he became the leader of the Turkish Cypriot community, it was very hard to see him as a party in the conflict. I would see him above that. I would see him the equivalent of what Homer would describe Nestor in the Iliad, the wise person, the tactician, the person who doesn't fight anymore, but gives the speeches to the troops and encourages them to do the right thing, the wise person in the negotiation. Something that we're missing in the last few decades in the Greek Cypriot community. I wouldn't give a metaphor of a Greek Cypriot in the Iliad because that will cause controversy, but with the Turkish Cypriots, we can talk about the legitimacy that the moderate Turkish Cypriots have brought in particular Mustafa Akinci, and through which Meltem is obviously connected. So this wise network is very important here in terms of promoting ideas that are credible, ideas that people could listen to both domestically and also in international fora. But in terms of the more specific details of what Meltem has done, it was a combination of both changing the structure of incentives and also changing the actors. So when it comes to the structure of incentives, the assumption in Cyprus, and going back to the idea that everything was wrong in the process design, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That was the main argument here. And what we offer in opposition to that is that even small changes and progress could be extremely important. We can think of gradualist approaches as an alternative to that, and creative ways of doing that. So giving scenarios to the negotiators of how this gradualist approach will work out. In addition to that, bringing in the citizens. And not bringing the citizens in a way that is romantic and unstructured, but as İlke said, having the right process of involving the citizens. To begin with, one of the major advantages of civic assemblies is that the leaders might not necessarily take it too seriously as an idea. They say, okay, we're going to involve the citizens, but we're not really making a concession. That gives us an advantage, because then we can build a structure that can have long-term benefits. Once you build the structure will be there when the leader leaves, and it can benefit you later on as well. So the payoff translates to long-term gains. It's an investment that pays off later on. So what we have suggested is the most likely to be adopted model. We thought that a model similar to the East Belgian model, the Oost Belgian model, and this is where we came up with specific suggestion and the design, would be the most ideal. It's a two-tier system where the leaders appoint the steering committee. The steering committee gives a mandate to the civic assemblies. So it's leader-led at the top level, but then the assemblies themselves are chosen by randomly selected citizens. And again, here we provided the methodology of how to randomly select citizens who come together to address a particular challenge given to them by their leaders. And of course, these models allows for consultation, but also they can decide whether they can have the decisions of the civic assemblies, of the randomly selected citizens from the two communities, being binding as well. We also added other elements into the discussion. For instance, one big facilitator of the whole process is using artificial intelligence, working with AI companies, convincing them that it will be great publicity for them if they give us access to their platforms, using the entire pipeline of AIs to support the civic assemblies, educating those who potentially participate in the AI world. This is Charis' big contribution and her roles. They can talk a little bit more about that as well. Now, the final point here is, how can we know this will not be symbolic and be more substantive? This is, of course, something we're going to be trying in the negotiations, and there's always a danger that this is going to work only in marginal areas. In fact, this is how it's starting. The negotiators would like to use it only on issues that are not sensitive, issues that involve education, humanitarian issues, and so on. There's no problem with that, because that can build legitimacy in the process. But my feeling is that once they see the benefits and once people embrace the idea, it could lead to something bigger. I mean, this is a classic theories of international relations and comparative politics, functionalist theories. Once you try something and you realize that the public is engaged, the public finds it positive, then you move on to further applications. And again, this is underpinned by academic work we have done, which shows that within the citizenship, you have zones of possible agreement. And again, what the literature shows that is informing this work and is informed by your own research is that elites might have different structural preferences than citizens. So you think, for instance, some classic questions in the Cyprus puzzle, leaders are very interested in power. They're very interested in how governance and how many people are elected and in which position. Citizens might be interested more in compensations and the delivery of services. This is something we find with work with colleagues. So very important here to start thinking in terms of the substance and what citizens can bring in terms of the legitimacy and in terms of the overall contributions. But the theory here can strongly advise us in terms of what we see elsewhere in terms of the deliberative way, the consensus that we see among citizens across divided communities. We see that in Bosnia, in Northern Ireland. We recently completed some work in New Caledonia, where the citizens, even though they come from different directions, they all agree that they should have a bigger stake in the negotiations. Now, why this is very important in Cyprus, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that everything that we have agreed so far in Cyprus has been in opposition to what we know in the classic theories of negotiation and in the conflict resolution toolkit. And one of the biggest, if you wish, agreements in the Cyprus negotiations is that one day we're going to have a referendum. Referendums are not a good way of deciding on peace issues. And especially winning 2 referendums is a Sisyphean task. It's a Herculean task. There's no successful peace referendum in this century. Maybe one. We're disputing that with the United Nations every time we're making that reference and putting the footnote here. But the question is very difficult to be addressed, and it's already agreed in Cyprus that we're going to have simultaneous referenda, which again is very, very hard to win because you're making a campaign on the Greek Cypriot community, and the hardliners on the other side, they hear you, and they're using it. This is what they said. They said they're going to all return back and take our properties. So you have those questions here, and that's why works that look at public opinion are very important. That's why works that prepare the public in civic assemblies are very important. The most substantive, if I have to put the target of the civic assemblies, which you have done so much work, Meltem, in pilot testing them, working with diaspora, working with monocommunal groups, bicommunal groups, is to bring it to a level that we know so much about the public, and we find the settlement so close to civic preferences, and we pilot tested it in so many different forums, that by the time we reach the referendum, the parties are convinced, the leaders are convinced, and we talk to so many citizens that the referendum becomes a formality. So that would be the other extreme to just having a symbolic contribution, engaging so much with the public to so many different levels that the referendum becomes a formality, or at least it becomes less risky than we originally thought about. So to conclude with this proposal, we're following the deliberative way, we follow the standard procedures of what is happening in the world, we're bringing more theory and more expertise in the Cyprus negotiations, and also we bring new hope to what could be possible in terms of outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. And just also a couple of things that came to my mind as I was listening to Neil is that negotiations and peace building is not about consensus building, right? It's about convergences and it's about deliberation. And maybe sometimes we try to agree too much, and in a healthy disagreement, it's about the overlap that we create and the convergences. And it made me think about groupthink versus spreadthink. When delegates or political parties, they create groupthink, and they have 3 ideas and they stick to those ideas. And when we ask too many people, we create spreadthink. And if you have 3 ideas, you're not going to create convergences. And if you have 300 ideas, decision making and convergences become difficult as well. So again, we come back to that process, facilitation and structure to balance groupthink with spreadthink. And because peace building time horizons are also so much longer than political mandates. So that legacy, what structure can carry on when political mandate time horizons are this short. So over to Charis. I don't know anyone who wrote more about intergroup relations than him. Longitudinally, he innovates, whether it's with AI or with research methods, with Reconciliation Observatory, and a very, very prolific activist in intergroup relations. Thank you, Harry. Over to you.
Thank you. I will continue from where Neophytos stopped. It's where the gap we identified from my perspective. I'm a social developmental psychologist, and I work in the University of Cyprus. I do bicommunal research, usually with large-scale representative sample surveys. So what we have been doing in the last 20 years is to try to understand the hopes and fears of both communities about the Cyprus issue, what kind of ideal they have in their heads, what they could compromise on, the range of acceptance of different possible solutions. And we have been working on that with Neophytos a lot. And we used a variety of tools, research tools and methods. I could give you some ideas about those and how they fit into the broader effort here to create something new in terms of process. So the first is I will start from the large-scale representative surveys, because one of the major findings that comes out of this research program is that both communities, in their vast majority, can accept bizonal bicommunal federation. But we have seen in the last 5 years, for example, that when a new leadership was elected in the north, when Ersin Dadar was in power, along with Turkey, they shifted away from bizonal bicommunal federation towards a two-state solution. So from that perspective, we knew that a two-state solution is clearly rejected by Greek Cypriots. So that could not actually move. But we had an election recently in the north, and Tufan Hürman got elected, and he's pro-BBM, and he's very well known for that. So we know that now there is a realistic opportunity, actually, for a solution that would come under bizonal bicommunal federation and be accepted by both communities. But actually, this is not enough, and that brings me to the second kind of research tool and methods we use, the conjoint analysis. Conjoint analysis is a kind of experiment where you try to understand what particular peace package could be accepted by both communities. So we're trying to identify the zones of possible agreement. And how do we do that? Let me give you an example. I want to create a new car, okay? So the color can be red, blue, white. It can be a saloon or sedan or whatever. So these are attributes. And then you have options. So in the case of the Cyprus problem, we know that there are different dossiers. So it's the territory issue, security issue, compensations for IDPs, the judicial system, the executive. This is what has been described by Guterres as the Guterres framework, and it was submitted in a particular form at Crans-Montana that failed. So the one major issue there is how can we go beyond that framework or propose something very similar to that framework that can still be accepted by both communities. So we applied this method, conjoint analysis, which is an experiment. You give people in great numbers, large representative surveys from both communities, a variety of these options in dyads as packages, and every time they select which is the best between two, and they do this 5 times. And once they do that, you run an algorithm, some mathematical algorithm that gives you which of these attributes is the most important for that community and the other community. It gives you the ideal package of one community or the other community, but it also gives you the peace package that can be accepted by both communities. And through that method, we went beyond the title of BBF. We understood that there are at least 118 variations of the Guterres framework that in simulated referendums can actually get 55 plus in referendums. So we know that there is the possibility of an agreement, and we know the varieties. But the question here is, do we have the political will at the top level, the elite level, to reach that kind of compromise? And here comes civic assemblies. Because if we know that, how do you bring the will of people to discuss and to actually come to, through discussion, to suggest these ideas to the leaders also, and gain legitimacy in the process without just being a top-down process. So that is really key for me, from my perspective, as a social developmental psychologist. Now then, to move on to the more practical issue of how do you organize these civic assemblies, I think in terms of preparing civic assemblies, you also need the help of AI and research, because you're not going there just with some broad ideas about what we negotiated in the past. You go there with ideas, yet you have some certain level of confidence that they will actually be accepted by both communities. So you can set the agenda, create a range of acceptable ideas to be discussed, and you can do that either through what I described up to now, or more recently, with the AI revolution, there are some, for the time being, some commercial AI tools. Maybe you know some of them. Rimesh AI. Rimesh AI is an online focus group discussion platform where you can actually have at the same time thousands of people from both communities discussing the same issue. And it's a chat-like platform where you set the questions as a researcher, you get their demographics, so you can do segmentation and understand differences and be within each community. And they chat for an hour, about an hour, on the issues you set for them. So it might be very specific or very broad issues. It can be about the process design of civic assemblies. It can be about the substance, some of the dossiers. It can be about property, about education, whatever, you name it.
In their languages, in their own languages.
Yes.
No language
And
barrier.
also in their own language. So you overcome the language barrier that we have in Cyprus because they can chat in their own language. The AI will immediately translate automatically. They will get the idea, and then it will be shown to all those in the discussion and evaluate their acceptance or rejection of the idea. So if you have a series of topics discussed through an hour, you end up with a very good understanding of what can be accepted by both communities to be taken for discussion of the civic assemblies. And through that method, you actually spend much less on the final assemblies, physical assemblies. You get people engaged around the geography of Cyprus because, you know, there are people who are far away in Garpasia, in Paphos. You know, everything related to intercommunal relations in Cyprus usually takes place in Nicosia. So we're Nicosia-centric in a way. How do you decentralize? Well, AI and online digital discussions are actually a perfect way to do it. So we hit two birds with one stone. We promote direct contact and indirect contact through these discussions, and at the same time we prepare civic assemblies to be successful. I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charis. In the interest of time and in full honesty, because I would not do justice in introducing Allison, I'll pass the ball to you, and if you could introduce yourself as well, and then we'll pass the ball to the audience after Allison's contributions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilke. So I'm Allison McCulloch. I'm a professor of political science at Brandon University in Manitoba, Canada. I am a principal investigator on the Inclusive Peace Project with NEO and with others involved. And I think I'm on this panel because I got added to a WhatsApp group where a lot of these ideas for the proposal were beginning to come together, and they reflect some of the work that I've been doing on how to build inclusive power sharing settlements and how to sustain and adapt them over time. So what I'd like to do with the amount of time I have today is sort of to situate this proposal and how it's sort of come to life within that wider literature and practice of deliberative democracy and peacemaking. And I'd like to suggest that the proposal is innovative, it is feasible, it is context sensitive, and it is in line with good practices in process design that we have seen elsewhere. So as Neo mentioned, we are sort of in what the OECD calls a deliberative wave. One that really began in the 1980s, but has seen a surge in the 2010s and 2020s. So the OECD deliberative database notes 733 cases of deliberative processes between 1979 and 2023. Focused primarily on OECD countries, including well-known examples like Belgium and Ireland. So Ireland has made good use of citizens' assemblies on a number of issues, from thinking about fixed terms in parliament to the use of referendums on climate change, on population aging, and of course, most notably on women's reproductive rights. Participedia, a global crowdsourcing platform, tracks 160 countries where democratic innovations have been deployed, including civic assemblies, participatory budgeting, town hall meetings, deliberative polling, and other types of mini-publics. And as discussed at yesterday's book panel on deliberative peacemaking, which is my forthcoming, let's put a plug for my forthcoming book, that is co-edited with Ian O'Flynn and Ron Levy, we look at how civic assemblies and other deliberative processes have been organized in a number of divided places, including Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Lebanon, Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala. We see it in Nepal, in the Bangsamoro region, the Philippines, and of course in New Caledonia. So for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there have been local citizens' assemblies on things like clean cities and tourism, other sort of municipal issues that have gathered sort of good support across community divides. But they've also had a nationally convened one on the question of constitutional reform, which is a seemingly intractable issue. Since 2009, leaders have had many failed attempts to consider how to reform the presidency and the upper house of parliament. And this was something that citizens were able to come to a consensus on over the course of that process. Of course, its uptake by political leaders is a different question. But certainly one of the things we know is that a central dynamic in how these kinds of deliberative processes work hinges on what we call institutional priming, or where introducing carefully structured deliberative processes into a conflict can jumpstart deliberation between groups or can help to restart those that have stalled, highlighting the importance of process design. They also show that they are an important means for building trust as a way to secure peacemaking, both in the short term to get to an agreement and over the long term, over the life of an agreement. So that's building trust between political leaders from different communities, between leaders and the wider public, and within the wider public amongst themselves as well. Right? Trust being, the trust in the process can help to both produce an agreement and sustain it over time. So for it to have that kind of effect, there's sort of three key issues related to process design that need thoughtful consideration. Who participates, or what method of inclusion, how they participate, or what the mode of deliberation is, and then the effect of that participation, or the capacity for it to have influence. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these. So in terms of the question of who participates, there's a general consensus on a random sort of stratified selection process, making sure that those who participate in the process are a representative sample of the macro public. That helps to support principles of political equality, in that everyone who has a stake in the outcome has an equal shot of being selected to be part of that process, right? So building inclusion in at the front end. One of the challenges, though, is once you get people around the table, is to think about how they actually are communicating with one another. Some people might be better at articulating their views in sort of rational, reasonable terms. We see that there's often challenges in terms of gender and race and class, in terms of whose voices are heard. Those who project a kind of epistemological authority are more likely to be listened to than others. So that highlights the importance of trained facilitators and trusted experts to be involved at all stages of that process, right? Thinking about how those facilitators are selected, their suitability, their independence, they're bringing different perspectives. And I think, again, the proposal with its standing sort of civic advisory council has sort of thought about that and thinking about how to bring in different perspectives and ensuring that sort of, inclusive understanding. That interdisciplinary group of academics and civil society practitioners and other sort of specialists as well. The other thing in thinking about what deliberation looks like is that deliberation is actually a disturbance of our everyday reasoning habits, right? And that is something that we have to account for in a deliberative process. So we typically, as we move through life, use lots of information shortcuts like party affiliation or media frames or perceptions of winning and losing sides. And for the efficacy of deliberation to take hold, we need to be able to work against those sort of impulses and to think about how it is that we come come together. And again, this is particularly important in multilingual settings, thinking about what language people are communicating in. While I am a little more skeptical of the use of AI than some of my colleagues, I think this is one of the areas where it can be put to good use, particularly for that translation piece, right? So that people speaking different languages are in communication with one another. And we have seen the UN has used Remesh in other processes as well, including in Yemen and Libya and elsewhere. So there is precedent for thinking about some of those tools. And then finally, I think the other thing to think about is the product of deliberative talk, right? What happens in the mini public and policy making. And in many cases, these are merely advisory or consultative. What they decide may or may not be taken up by elected representatives. And participants in those kinds of processes are often encouraged to see it as an opportunity to learn rather than to offer guidance to policymakers. But I think that there is a way in thinking about how you want to ensure that what happens in that space is sort of moved upwards in the decision-making change, and to think about the ways in which elites are then responsible for engaging with those kinds of proposals. And that can be tricky because political leaders often do not want to, devolve that kind of power or let go of that final decision-making. But I think there are ways this can be facilitated, and I think that the proposal has some really thoughtful ideas on how this can support leaders that rather than overtake them, particularly on difficult and sensitive topics. And then I think this has been raised already, the crucial part is what happens next, right? That question of publicity and widespread reporting. So mini publics or civic assemblies need to transfer what happens in that space back to that wider public as well. Particularly if there is a tie-in with a referendum, it becomes all the more important, right? That peace preparation piece and what happens after that process. This cannot simply be a report that is filed away in a drawer somewhere and has to go hand in hand with an education campaign and dissemination to the wider public. And again, I think the proposal has that sort of after piece in mind as well, right? To begin to think about that sort of more less than a one-off ad hoc, but more of a standing sort of process. So I think that, again, what we see in this proposal are some really sort of thoughtful process design considerations that are meant to, again, build towards that kind of momentum. And maybe, again, just to sort of think about how very often peace agreements are often very sort of lowest common denominator settlements. It's like just that little piece that people can agree on. But these kinds of deliberative peace-making processes, I think, offer a possible pathway towards much more sustainable shared futures rather than simply fragile compromises. And maybe I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison. Good.
We have time.
Good. Please, yes.
In terms of process, how do you know, is there anything in the process that helps you to get to the sense of we have followed these things and now we know that we're kind of at that point that when we do the referendum, we have reached enough people, there's been enough engagement, enough participation. So how do you actually know we are now at a place where we can go to referendum and know there was sufficient participation?
Thank you, Magda. We'll take a few questions and then I'll pass the ball back to the panel.
There's been a lot of civic engagement. Money is always the issue because we've all been volunteers. So where does that money come from? Considering there's this pushback on especially women's rights. And the second one is AI. I think AI is a very interesting concept. But how educated is civil society, and I'm including myself, on how to use AI? And there again, are you not limiting yourself to people that have access to internet? So you're again excluding a certain part of the population, which we are Nicosia-centric. Our biggest issue is to include the outlying areas, not only the Limassol and Perinas and Impasse, but it's also to include the rural areas. So how do you also ensure that the rural society, people that don't have access to internet, are included in conversation?
I wonder, how do you deal with the veto groups within these processes? If you have a representative sample, so you probably end up having some people that are not really into this. So how do you stop them from ruining the whole process?
So do you think it's possible to start really implementing, picking this low-hanging fruit and try to implement so it's become normal for people to have more and more peaceful decisions? And interrelated question with that, you also talk about deliberative democracy and the way that, yes, people come from very different background, epistemologies and skills. And in my experience working in different communities, it's not only about preparing facilitators, it's actually preparing people. It's legal literacy, it's negotiation literacy, and how do you address this, especially in civic assemblies inside?
I have two questions. One has to do with legitimacy in terms of to what extent the political elites, and especially the leaders, have committed to really engaging with the products of these processes of the citizens. And the second one is, have you thought of readjusting the process as the political environment changes? Because the political environment is very dynamic. And to what extent these external changes can really influence what the citizens will bring in these processes of deliberation and so on. And finally is the transfer. The transfer both horizontally and vertically, so as to create a different culture of a democratic participation. We are a traditional society where the political parties have a lot of power and it's top down usually, and we all know what that means in that respect. And the voices of women, for me, is very important in these processes, because all the processes have been so male-dominated. We've got to find ways to push that different voice. Thank you.
My question is related to social media. Since we live in a social media era, misinformation and disinformation is something we also have to manage during the negotiations, I believe. And this also relates to Meltem's comment about lack of transparency of the negotiation processes. And especially in the social media, this is very risky and dangerous, I believe, because that's why the leakages happen. And the leakages happen is not always to the benefit of the process. And usually it harms the process. And I see that there's a lacking component of communication management in the processes as well. What kind of information needs to go out to the public, when and how? This needs to be also considered, I believe. And the people owning the negotiation processes needs to manage it. If you don't manage it, and somebody else is like media manages it, and then it's out of control and everything gets messed up. Thank you.
Thank you.
About the digital divide or gap in terms of, which is a valid point, in terms of preparing the physical civic assemblies, let's call it that way. There are ways to go around this. I mean, you can go in the rural areas with tablets and do this kind of exercise. So you can cover that concern if you like. It's not so difficult. But let's not forget that this is just the preparatory phase, just to give the opportunity for people to get engaged somehow, but it's not the real physical assembly. The physical assembly will take place talking between people, that there is no digital barrier in that sense. There was also another point. Yeah, the social media, yeah. Probably you've seen that last week we've been in Strasbourg on this AI hackathon, and that's very relevant actually to what you are discussing, because you know one of the major issues we have been discussing there is how do you visualize the field of narratives of, let's say, there is a narrative against the Roma, against minorities, against refugees. How do you detect that narratives and sub-narratives in the social media landscape? And then how do you create counter-narratives and alternative narratives immediately? Okay, so that's easily adaptable to any future process comes?
Okay, I can reflect on Magda's very valid question and Maria's. And even I will try to combine. Magda asked about where the money would come. This is a real issue because for a proper citizen assembly methodology to be applied both sides to represent the communities, I mean randomly selected people, it would require. This is one of the reasons that we need buy-in from the leaderships. So it should be under the leaderships and their willingness, plus the UN, and of course EU Commission should be around. So I believe that if they genuinely, that they announced that they agreed to establish a consultative mechanism, that we hope that it would include a plenary session beside the steering committee kind of thing. And this plenary, so far they agreed that it would be worth to try or pilot citizen assembly randomly selected. Then I think funding such a project, let's say, which would be under the UN and the two leadership offices, would not be an issue. But I would combine with Maria's, because Maria says how we are going to manage to keep the leaders committed in these processes, because we know that at the first track, one or the other can simply walk away. It's such an easy. Suddenly they can say that, okay, we changed our mind, and it's there. So for this reason, as civic society level as well, okay, we don't have money as much as the leaders and the official structures would get, but still we need to find a way or ways and means that we also continue in a parallel way. It would not be maybe ideal, excellent, perfect, but we should also continue to provide them a model, pilot experiences. This is what we are trying to do as CPDC. I claim we have a project updating the Cyprus peace process via citizen assemblies. It's not a big project. We don't have a lot of money, but still it works, and this provides the leadership offices as well some pilot initial findings to share with them, and also to provide some expertise with groups like here and others, and this matters. And also, so far that we piloted these citizen assemblies, it's monocommunal. We haven't piloted bi-communal yet, but at least we done many work, focus groups, and also the assembly. We tested the methodology. It works. People are engaged. They are willing to engage, and they are very creative. Sometimes I feel that they would make better than the leaders. Don't tell anybody. So even they have innovative ideas in here, and the methodology is a very useful tool to inform them as well. So to keep them literate about the Cyprus peace process, and they are keen, because when you ask them the question, for example, what innovative methodologies would be useful to bring the leaders back to the table, or keep them at the table, or make them to deliver, etc., they start first to ask, okay, can we ask questions? So far on what they agreed, so far what are the gaps, so far what is the methodology, current methodology, and they want to hear all this and then reflect, and then they come up with some novelties and some ideas in there. So it's a kind of, as I said, that we need both grassroots and the elite level and the official level to interact with each other. Otherwise, if we leave it to the leaders only, it would not work. Anytime it would stop. So, and the only way to keep the leaders committed, Mariamo, is that the demand should come from the people. And this is the way also to keep people empowered, not only informed or educated. I don't like this informed, because it's like a hierarchical, yes, I will teach you something. No, we need to empower the citizens to be able to engage in a proper way and involved in the process and to feel that they would have a voice. But for this, they need to demand it, jointly ask for it to be there. I was hoping that maybe this joint demand first would come from the women, but up to now, I am also disappointed. So, but we need to continue to bring along women of Cyprus as well, from the diverse political spectrum in there. So still it's worth. The other segment of the community is maybe it's youth, but I don't think that in Cyprus would work only sticking on women or youth or any particular segment. It's generally civic society or citizens would help better. So all of us would demand a more inclusive peace process.
Let me clarify something about the methodology. So when we select people, we'll be randomly selected through possibly the electoral rolls. However, the people who accept will not be representative. And this is genuine. We know about this, and it's not problematic. In fact, it works better in terms of the methodology. Let's assume that 10% of the people reply they will be attending the assemblies. This 10%, you get more committed, you get slightly more educated, therefore they will be stronger in influencing others, and the people who care most about the particular topic you're dealing with. So if you have a civic assembly, like we're aiming to create one on properties and the displaced persons, people who want to return back to their original homes pre-1963, pre-1974, then you get a sample that is not representative. Yet these are the leaders who are going to convince others to return. They're going to make a case in favor of return. They're going to influence fellow citizens in terms of the prospects and validity and desire of return. So even if you get 10%, you still get the right group that you want to have in that room. And this tends to be the group that are either in favor of solution or skeptical, not the people who are against. And again, this is not a problem, because this is the demographic you want to target in a referendum. You might still get someone who's extremely against the settlement, which you're building on different scenarios here on hypothesis, is not problematic. In fact, is positive. You can have situations like the famous movie Best of Enemies, where you had the leader of Ku Klux Klan turning in favor of integration. This is a great movie to be including in your courses. If you haven't watched it, is exemplary in terms of what charrettes and civic assemblies could do in terms of transforming people. And that builds obviously legitimacy in process. And it's a test to your question as how do we know we're ready for a referendum once we see people switching from extreme movements in favor of peace. That's a good sign, right? You can never be completely sure. Referendums are extremely risky, so you need to take a risk. But what a civic assembly do, it can mitigate risk in various ways. It can increase the chances of succeeding in the first place, but even if you fail, it can create all these fallback solutions. Let me give you examples of those. One of them is what we're discussing currently in the negotiations. If a referendum fails, we still maintain some of the progress. So the referendum can take place in 18 months from now, if we sign a peace settlement today. And in the meantime, you have some changes in terms of the territorial adjustments, in terms of opening up airports and communication in the north. But even if the referendum fails, these progress is being kept. So we're discussing various solutions like that. Or having a second referendum was an idea that we're thinking about. It might fail. Let's try again. So these are ideas that the civic assemblies could suggest, and these are also ideas that the UN is discussing right now. But the problem is that, and here is your comparison, right? Right now, the UN suggests something, it's being leaked in the media, and then it's being attacked in the social world. So it's not an ideal scenario. What we're imagining is a much better situation where ideas are created by the public. They already have this legitimacy. People don't necessarily take them as seriously because they're citizens and not the United Nations diplomats. And gradually they win acceptance because those who are there in the civic assemblies have the capacity, they have the social media training, they have the AI training to do so. And here it takes me to my last point. Charis mentioned Ramesh. İlke and I talked to another AI company, Corpora, which is very good at creating these background memos and material for participants. Here again, one of the biggest weaknesses of the idea that we haven't really touched on is that people might not be experts on the topic that we're discussing. And some of the issues, as we move on from simpler issue to more complex one, require this complex understanding of institutional design. And here is where Corpora can be particularly useful in creating traceable material based on existing literature and existing policy documents. So we're getting citizens there and we're preparing them to such an extent that they have several research assistants. You can treat AI as research assistants, and Corpora is one of them, providing you all the background information and allowing you to go there with background knowledge. Some of these AIs are also particularly encouraging towards engaging with ideas such as arbitration. Every time we ask something with regards to what can we do on the Cyprus question, arbitration comes up as a potential option. And then we know from the leaders in Cyprus, they don't want to agree with the other side and let the other side have a veto, but at the same time, they don't want to have a neutral side intervening and helping in arbitration. Some of the AI platforms can do a great job in arbitrating between different positions. In fact, you can think of simulations where one group, the Turkish Cypriots, create one type of a solution on a particular issue. The other group, the Turkish Cypriots, create another solution. And AI decides among the solutions that the citizens have created which one is the most beneficial. It chooses one of the two, not a compromise. This is what we call baseball arbitration approaches in negotiation, because it forces each other to learn about the other community and what are their needs and design the solution accordingly. So AI can pick up some of these weaknesses while listening to the Ramesh platform at the same time. So we're talking not only about comparing AIs, but also integrating different strengths of AIs in the process of deliberation.
Thank
Sure.
you.
And maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk just about what the actual process looks like in that space, right? So thinking about what a day of deliberation might look like. So the first is that the people who are involved in it have to make their claims in terms of public reasons, right? So that's the first baseline, is that you have to make claims in terms of which others can accept as well. So it's not just from a self-interested perspective, and facilitators can help people, because often in the first round you don't know how to perhaps do that. There's a way in which helping through that process. So it's never just a free-for-all, right? It is a sort of highly structured process. The second thing is that the first half typically is kind of plenary session and a learning phase where, again, bring your experts in to talk through the issue, to provide that background from different perspectives, and everyone is in that learning phase together. You then move into those smaller groups, typically no more than 7 or 8 in a group, and again, with a well-trained facilitator who's making sure that one person, there's always that person in the group who takes all of the time and all of the oxygen, that kind of thing, making sure that there is greater distribution in terms of speaking time, in terms of different ideas coming forward. So it is, again, a highly structured kind of process that is ensuring that those different perspectives in those smaller groups before coming back to that wider group. So again, thinking about all of those spaces instances where someone who might be interested in thwarting the process, they might have an opportunity to have a little bit of time to speak, but they would not be co-opting the entire process because there is that sort of exchange of ideas first in terms that others can accept, and then in terms of making sure that facilitation process, so that people who are involved in deliberative processes have that preparation going in and are facilitated through the process when those sort of difficult moments might come about. And then again, thinking of it as a kind of perhaps phased approach where you might begin indirectly with issues where you might be able to reach consensus. You don't just start at, we're going to solve the Cyprus problem in one day through a deliberative process, right? It's a beginning, finding those sort of spaces of common ground and building out from there. So I think that speaks to the veto issue and that preparation piece.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison.
I originally come from the South Caucasus, been working on different contexts, including taking part in the negotiations, both formal and informal, in the context of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And I should say that we usually turn to Cyprus for both, to praise the progress and lots of confidence building measures and trust and all of that. But at the same time, we also turn to Cyprus to scare people that with is like what you will reach and then you cannot really proceed and all of that. And what I have been hearing today, and I'm so grateful for all the work that you are doing, which is fantastic. And I can imagine how much criticism that you receive for all of that. But I mean, so far, I've been hearing still kind of some ideas how to create engagement, kind of to overcome with lack of political will. Also models how to kind of find a way to proceed with the next steps. But I don't really understand if I were a Cypriot, no matter where I'm living, how I'm going to live with this, And in that sense, are you thinking, guys, about like some creating pilot zones where people kind of start the testing whether they can start living together, having joined police, joined, I don't know, schools or something, or it's actually outside of any considerations, Maybe you could elaborate a bit more about what's next, right?
Thank you.
I'm really curious about the representative sample. So my context, Patty Derbyshire, Simon Fraser University in Canada. I work largely in the reconciliation space with Indigenous peoples who make up between 5 and 6% of our population, but who are overly represented and often pathologized in health and education, gender-based violence, etc. And so I would want an over-representative sample. There are cultural aspects even about being forthcoming with your thoughts. And finally, an indigenously governed process would be very important, in which the role of non-Indigenous guests, new Canadians who are racialized, etc., I would want to take on the role of being witnesses first, because so little is known. So I'm curious about those aspects from a cultural perspective. And then finally, the consensus model is very important. And consensus, again, conceived differently than in the West. It's kind of a mishmash of ideas. Stephanie and I and Cherry could be talking and say like, oh, yes, all together it looks like this. So yeah, curious about, are there moments or could there be a progression of this methodology that allows first for relationality?
Thank you.
So, every time you engage the public, you create an expectation. And when that expectation is not met, people get disappointed, disengaged, and you have this apathy, which is actually very common in the political discourse. A lot of people don't want to engage because they feel, no matter how much they engage, they are not really taken seriously. And then when you engage tools like AI with data governance and, a lot of ethical considerations around that, where does that fit into that process? And how do you navigate that? How do you make sure that you honor the participation of people, all right? And not create more and more disappointments. And I'm not sure how relevant that is in the context of Cyprus, but there's been a lot of failed trials, and then how do you kind of bring people back from apathy to participation and building that trust?
Do you want to practice before we get married, moving together for a little bit? Yeah.
The question of overrepresentation is a very important one, and I would like to start with that. You could also focus on a particular groupings in a society. So, for instance, we have three smaller communities in Cyprus: Armenians, the Latins, and the Maronites. So you can have assemblies, civic assemblies, just for them. So their voice is not represented in the negotiations with a separate leader. That's where some of your work with indigenous communities could be particularly useful. Another area that we've been working with our group is diaspora participation. We have the refugee communities overrepresented in the Cypriot diaspora. So a lot of people who were displaced in 63 and 74 ended up in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in South Africa. Therefore, the civic assemblies could allow them to have a voice in a different way, different to their current representatives. We have run surveys in the diaspora as well, similar to the ones we have done in Cyprus. Recently completed a paper, published a paper where we ran the same experiment, conjoint experiment, both in the diaspora and in the local communities. We found that the diaspora mirrors the views of Cypriot island communities. They're not hardliners. They're not the so-called myth of long-distance nationalists does not apply, at least in the case of Cyprus. So engaging the diaspora to hear exactly how they would like to be included is very important in building a consensus, not just only in the island, but also abroad. That takes me back to the question that Magda asked about who is funding it, because what the leaders have right now is a CMP model, where governments will be making contributions to the diaspora. But I think more important is to the civic assemblies. More important to engage also with the diaspora. Lebanon has a very good model where the diasporas have been supporting the United Nations, and we want to transfer in Cyprus. But more broadly, if you're in an island who has so many resources, a critical test of whether things will work out in a referendum is talking to the 10 largest companies, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and asking them, would you like to pay money for peace? If the big companies do not want to pay money for peace, then you have a red flag. You give up, or you send them a letter and say, "Look, guys, you are responsible for. Stop blaming the leaders. Blame yourself." So some clever fundraising some clever fundraising here will be particularly important in building the consensus about what the consensus would look like. In the first place. And then the trust building exercise, very important. We know from contact theories that just putting people together might not work. In fact, there is a more traditional conflict resolution work that places that Judge Mason has introduced many decades ago, and people like John Burton here in the UK, of training people with trust building exercises in the first place, and there are a group of those exercises we can introduce in civic assemblies. So you build some trust from the beginning, and then you engage with more difficult questions. So this is something we're aware of, and we're discussing also in our proposal of how we can build these trust building exercises to the agenda of the civic assemblies. People, in terms of trust, also people would like to know that whatever time they put will be somehow compensated, not only financially, but also in terms of being listened later on. So even though their recommendations might not be binding, we need to have a structure there. They need to receive feedback from the leaders. They need to meet the leaders. They need to meet the political parties. Maybe the UN, leading representatives of the UN, come and listen to these ideas. So these are very important in terms of engaging with the citizens in a way that is respectful and trustful at the same time.
I can also reflect on Olesia, yes? Olesia that very rightly said, have you ever tried other models or step-by-step approach or evolutionary approach, or a third zone instead of 2 zones, or something else, or a trade-off Varosha vis-a-vis treaties, etc. So some bigger scale confidence building measures. Bad news that all these ideas were put forward and were put on the negotiation table, but the sides, I mean the parties of the conflict, they never agreed on any of these ideas because we need not to forget the nature of the Cyprus problem is basically a power sharing problem. It's a political power sharing problem, and it's not only power sharing between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, it's also power balancing the regional powers, Turkey, Greece, UK, and currently new actors, Israel and America, they are in there. And this problem, this power sharing and power balancing problem started even before 1960. Even before the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus, which was a partnership for Turkish Cypriots, but which was not a partnership for the majority of the Greek Cypriots. It was unfair for them because they took the problem as a majority minority, and they felt that they were pressurized and forced to accept the 1960 Republic of Cyprus. So it didn't run. It ended up in 3 years. The United Nations peacekeeping forces landed to Ireland in 64. So it's not all about 74. And so the other chapters of the Cyprus issue, I mean property, territory, security guarantees, they added after 74. So, but the main issue is the power sharing. So when it comes even a greater scale confidence building, like why don't we trade off Varosha, or why don't we trade off some other territory and then get some power, etc. It doesn't work because still the Greek Cypriot side thinks that it would leverage, I mean, increase the status of the Turkish Cypriots. It would be hidden recognition if they enter in any structure to make these trade-offs. Even in the lesser scale, at the technical committees that we offer some confidence building measures, which is not greater scale, very small, then this issue is there, recognition with implication for the Greek Cypriot official stance and position. And for the Turkish Cypriot side, again, getting some recognition, which is the correct in there, or getting there in an equal basis, etc. And the Cypriots, in fact, they are more realists because when you go to the citizens, they know all these. I'm not sure about the younger generations because younger generations are more like they are used to live under the status quo. And here again, this asymmetric power balance influence that one side would take their time until a better solution would come, whether it is BBF or the other. This is also relevant and correct for Turkey as well. Turkey also, she doesn't have a sense of urgency. So maybe it's only the Turkish Cypriot community who have this sense of urgency. But when it comes to security concerns, then even them it's not very easy to say yes, everything. And about the security issue again, I would like to make this highlight that for Greek Cypriots, security concern, security threat perception comes from externally, I mean, from Turkey. But for the Turkish Cypriots, threat is internal. So the majority, Greek Cypriot majority and dominancy is the threat. But when it comes that they negotiate, they usually take it granted as if the concerns are more or less similar, which is not. Similarly, the other chapters as well. So sometimes personalities like Özdilnami, for example, he is against evolutionary approach, against step-by-step approach, against even this trying new innovations because they will lose time, they say. But people like us, we say that, okay, the ideal is the comprehensive settlement to reach there. But maybe some innovative ideas to try the step-by-step approach or the evolutionary thing again, but whatever the innovative idea is, you need to agree on. All parties of the conflict needs to agree. So Olesia also asked why don't you divorce them? But even for divorce, you need to agree. Right. For two-state, again, you need to negotiate the two-state. You need to negotiate the terms of the divorce. You need to negotiate, and the Greek Cypriot side, as Charis said, they are not willing to negotiate terms of divorce willingly. So we did, this would take some more time, and we will need all of you as experts, the ideas and contributions, and would welcome to stay in contact. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to? Thank you so much. I'm going to, with these notes, close our panel. Thank you so much for your questions and for such a stimulating and critical reflection. It was a pleasure for us, and hope to see you around to continue the conversation.